In this video, I'm going to show you how to use dodge and burn tools to intensify highlights and deeper shadows in your photograph. So the very first thing that you are going to want to do is to make a copy of your background, and this is going to be our retouch layer. On your retouch layer is where you're going to want to use your dodge and burn tools. These are located over here on the left-hand side where my mouse is circling around. If I right-click, I have my dodge tool, which is at the top, and that's the tool that you'll use to intensify highlights. And then I have my burn tool below, which is used to deepen shadows. So first I'm going to demonstrate how to use the dodge tool. Like any tool located on the left-hand side of the Photoshop window, there are going to be additional options that are located up here at the top. So, of course, we're going to want to work with a soft brush, and that is so we're not having those really hard edges when we're applying the dodge tool. The range right here, which I will come to in just a second, should be used whenever you are applying the dodge tool to specific tones in your image. So are you going to apply your intensified highlights to the highlights of the image? Are you going to do it to the midtones of the image or the shadows of the image? So we'll come to that in just a second. Your exposure is obviously the intensity that you are applying your dodge tool to. So if you set it at 10% exposure, that's going to be a really low intensity of applying your highlights or bumping up your highlights. If you set it to 100% exposure, it's going to be really intense. So I think it's always better to start at a lower number, and then if you need to bump it up or bump it down, then you can do it at that point. So I'm just going to leave it at 50%. I'm going to use the brackets on my keyboard to make my brush bigger or smaller, and those are located next to your P on your keyboard. And I want to actually bring out these highlights right here on the outside of this stained glass window. I'm also going to want to brighten up this little stained glass piece right up here in the upper left-hand corner as well. So the tones that I'm going to be selecting or wanting to brighten up in this image are actually the midtones, which is already selected. If I wanted to brighten up the highlights, like in the stained glass window kind of right here in the center, I would select highlights from my range. If I wanted to brighten up the shadows, which are these really darker areas in the image, I would select shadows, okay? So I'm going to go to midtones, and I'm going to start to brush over the outside of this window right here. And it's kind of difficult to see the dodge and burn tools at play as you're applying them, because if you're working at a lower exposure and with a soft brush, it should take you a couple of strokes to kind of build up that intensity, okay? So there's that. I'm going to come up here, make my brush bigger, and brighten up this little glass up here in the upper left-hand corner. So I think that that's good. So now when I come over here to my layers panel and I turn my retouch layer off and on, you'll notice that those areas that I was brushing over are a lot more intense and brighter now. And I like the details that actually came out, especially in this little strip right here that I was going over. So again, using the dodge tool will enable you to intensify highlights. So now, if I want to go over and darken some areas or deepen shadows, I'm going to select my burn tool. Additional options again for your burn tool are going to be located up here at the top. I'm going to select shadows from my range, and I am going to brush over this little section right here that's kind of bright. So I'm going to tone that down, and you'll notice that that just kind of disappeared. I'm going to select my midtones now, and I'm going to get rid of this guy right here, so it may take a couple of strokes to get rid of that. You shouldn't use the burn tool to totally eliminate something unless you have an all black background, because otherwise it's just going to create kind of grayish, blackish streaks. I'm also going to make my brush a little bit bigger. I'm going to lower my exposure now. Let's set this to about 30%. And I'm going to brush over this window right here in the left-hand corner just to tone down how bright that is because I think it's taking away the attention from this window. And then I'm going to select my highlights and I'm going to tone down these highlights right in here just to kind of balance everything out a little bit. Set that to about 10%. And come over here and just tone down these highlights just a little bit. So again, hard to see at first, but when I turn the eyeball on and off, you'll really be able to notice a difference. So let's take a look up here first. We'll turn the eyeball off and on. So that is now gone. If you take a look over at the left, before and after, I just toned down that glass on the left-hand side, deepen the shadows. And then here in the center of the glass, where kind of the focal point is, before and after, I just lessen the intensity of those highlights a little bit by burning them. So you can really do anything with these that you like. If I wanted to get really nitty gritty and make my brush, let's go ahead and select shadows. Let's do 90% exposure. And I'll make my brush really small. And I want to go over all of these individual lines in my glass to make them nice and dark. You can do that. The more time that you spend using the dodge and burn tools, really just the nicer your image gets because you really can control and clean up the areas that you want to be super bright or super dark or have nice contrast in your image. And I'm just brushing over all of these little individual panes. And so if I turn the eyeball off and on, you'll notice that those got darker as well. And that is using the dodge and burn tools.